The deck of the Isolde was rough beneath Dorian's hands as he pulled himself aboard. The ship rocked gently, a reminder that he was stepping onto something untethered, something that belonged more to the shifting tides than to any man. The captain, if he could be called that, nodded in approval. Up close, he was younger than Dorian had thought, perhaps only a few years older than himself. His hair was dark, sun-bleached in places, and his skin bore the kind of tan that only came from years. Bent beneath an open sky. "Elias," the man said, extending a hand. Dorian hesitated before shaking it. "Dorian, welcome aboard." Elias turned toward the ropes and rigging, speaking without looking back. "Not much in the way of comforts, but the Isolde will take you where you need to go." Dorian didn't respond. He had long stopped believing in places of arrival, in destinations that meant something. The Isolde was just another ship, another step away from wherever he had been before. That night he lay awake beneath the open sky. The ship rocked gently in the harbor, the wooden planks beneath him creaking with each movement. He had been given a place to sleep below deck, but he chose instead to stay above, watching the stars. In his pocket, the letter remained folded, unread. He did not need to open it to know what it said. The past was not so easily left behind. By dawn, the sails had been unfurled and the Isolde was moving. The town, with its narrow streets and indifferent faces, shrank behind them, consumed by the mist of morning. Elias stood at the helm, the wind tugging at his shirt. He navigated the ship with ease, as though the sea had long accepted him as its own. Dorian kept to himself. He had no place among the ropes and sails, no knowledge of the wind's language. But he watched. He learned. Elias, for his part, said little. He gave no orders, no expectations. He let Dorian exist as he was, adrift, uncertain. Days passed in quiet rhythm. The sea stretched endless in every direction. And for the first time in years, Dorian felt something unfamiliar. Not peace, not yet, but something close. The days at sea blurred into one another, the passage of time marked only by the shifting of the sun and the pull of the tides. Dorian fell into a rhythm he hadn't known he was capable of, waking before dawn, his hands rough with rope burns, his muscles aching from work he had never done before. Elias did not teach with words. He didn't explain how to tie knots or how to read the wind. He simply did, and expected Dorian to follow. The unspoken lessons were frustrating at first, but Dorian adapted. He always had. One evening, as the sky bled into the horizon, Elias leaned against the rail, watching the waves roll beneath the ship. "You're not running," he said. It wasn't a question. Dorian didn't look at him. He had learned that Elias had a way of seeing things before a man was ready to speak them, aloud. "I didn't say I was," he replied. Elias exhaled, thoughtful. "People who run don't stop to learn how to sail." Dorian had no response to that. The letter still sat in his pocket, unread. At night, when the ship was quiet and only the sound of the waves filled the air, he would reach for it, his fingers brushing against the worn edges, but he never unfolded it. The sea stretched endless before them, no destination in sight. For the first time, that didn't feel like a weight. It felt like possibility. The wind picked up as the days stretched into weeks. Dorian's hands no longer fumbled with the ropes, his balance steady even as the Isolde tilted against the waves. The bruises on his palms had hardened into calluses, the sting of salt and sun now familiar instead of punishing. Elias never praised, never acknowledged the change aloud, but there were moments, small, fleeting, where Dorian caught him watching, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with something quieter. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. One evening, as the sky turned the color of dying embers, Elias passed him a tin cup filled with something strong, burning. The two stood by the railing, the ocean stretching endless before them. "You ever going to read it?" Elias asked. Dorian tensed. He didn't have to ask what it was. He reached into his pocket, feeling the edges of the letter, soft from years of handling. The weight of it had followed him across towns, across borders, across years. He had carried it like an anchor, convincing, Himself that one day he would open it. His fingers curled around the paper. I don't know. Elias took a sip from his cup, unbothered. Then don't. Dorian blinked. He had expected something else. A push, a lesson, a demand. Did he face whatever it was he had spent so long avoiding? But Elias simply turned his gaze back to the horizon, as if the answer had never mattered. For the first time in years, Dorian let go of the letter. Not in the way he always had, holding on to it but never unfolding it. This time, truly, he let go. The wind caught it before it hit the water, carrying it somewhere beyond the edge of sight. Elias said nothing. Dorian didn't need him to. The wind shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the air, a whisper in the rigging. But Elias noticed. And so did Dorian. Storms did not announce themselves with fury. Not at first. They crept in, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal their strength. Elias stood at the bow, eyes on the darkening horizon. We'll need to trim the sails. Dorian didn't hesitate. He moved without being told, hands steady as he climbed the rigging, pulling at the ropes, securing them before the wind could take hold. The muscles in his arms burned, but he did not falter. By the time he descended, the sky had changed. Clouds gathered, thick and restless. The sea, once calm, now rolled with a quiet promise. Elias glanced at him. You afraid? Dorian wiped his palms on his trousers. No, it wasn't. Bravado. It was the truth. Fear had been a companion once, something he had carried as surely as the letter that was now lost to the waves. But out here, fear had no place. The wind howled, the first drops of rain cold against his skin. The Isolde rocked, beneath them, alive with motion. Elias grinned, wild and fearless. Good. The storm was coming and Dorian was ready. The stars wheeled overhead as the Isolde cut through the dark water, its bow slicing the waves like a blade. Dorian's hands stayed firm on the wheel, his grip steady even as the wind shifted, testing him. Elias stood beside him, silent, watching. He had not given instructions, no careful explanations of what to do. Just the wheel, the wind, and the open sea. Dorian adjusted, feeling the ship respond beneath him. It was subtle, the way it moved. Not a thing to be forced, but something to be understood. He wasn't just commanding it, he was listening to it. The realization settled in his chest, slow and quiet. You're not correcting me, Dorian said. Elias smirked. You're not making mistakes. Dorian exhaled, long and steady. For years he had lived by reaction, running when the past caught up, stopping when exhaustion forced him to, moving only when the world pushed him forward. Now, for the first time, he was choosing the direction. A gust of wind pulled at the sails. He adjusted the wheel slightly, instinct guiding his hands. The ship obeyed. Elias clapped him once on the shoulder before stepping away, leaving him alone at the helm. Dorian did not look back. For the first time in years, he didn't need to. The days stretched into one another, the sea vast and unbroken in all directions. Dorian no longer counted them. Time here was different, measured not in hours or days, but in the movement of the waves, the shifting of the wind, the quiet rhythm of work that never truly ended. He had found his place among the ship's routine, not because it was given to him, but because he had taken it. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elias handed him a length of rope. Tie it, he said simply. Dorian frowned. Which knot? Elias raised a brow, as if the answer should have been obvious. The right one. Dorian exhaled through his nose. The lesson was clear. There were no instructions out here, no step-by-step guidance, just the problem and the solution. His fingers moved on their own, muscle memory taking over. The knot took shape, tight and sure. Elias gave it a tug, testing. He nodded. Good. Then he tossed another length of rope at him. Do it again. Dorian didn't argue. It went like this for hours. Knots, adjustments, tightening sails, reading the wind. Elias never explained why, never gave more than a quiet nod of approval when Dorian got it right. But that was enough. As the sun set, the sea stretched golden before them, the water smooth as glass. Dorian stood by the railing, the salt air in his lungs. Elias leaned beside him, arms crossed. "You still don't ask where we're going." Dorian considered the words. "I don't need to," he said. Elias smirked. "No, I suppose you don't." The Isolde sailed on, into the unknown, and, for the first time, Dorian didn't feel lost. Oh, hi, Detto. The storm struck with a fury that swallowed the world. Waves rose like mountains, crashing against the Isolde with a force that sent shudders through its wooden frame. The wind screamed through the rigging, tearing at the sails, testing the ship's strength, and theirs. Dorian moved without thinking. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. Rain lashed his face, salt and water blurring his vision, but his hands found the ropes, his body bracing against the violent sway of the deck. Elias was at the helm, feet planted firm, his expression sharp with focus. He shouted something, but the wind tore the words away. Dorian didn't need to hear them. He climbed, hands gripping slick wood, legs straining against the pull of gravity as he reached the mainsail. The wind threatened to rip it free, the ropes snapping and thrashing like living things. He seized them, wrapping them around his forearms, muscles burning as he fought to keep the sail from splitting apart. The ship tilted dangerously, the sea, rising dark and endless below. For one terrible moment it felt like the Isolde might lose, then a shift. A break in the wind. The ship leveled, its bow cutting through the waves instead of being swallowed by them. Dorian secured the last knot, breath ragged, his arms trembling. When he climbed down, Elias was waiting. They stood there, rain pouring, the storm still raging around them, but the ship held. They had held. Elias nodded once. No words, just understanding. Dorian nodded back. For the first time, he knew he was no longer just a passenger. The storm raged through the night, but the Isolde did not break. Dorian worked alongside the crew, soaked to the bone, his muscles screaming with effort. He lashed down whatever the wind tried to steal, hauled ropes with hands rubbed raw, and braced against every violent tilt of the deck. By dawn, the worst had passed. The waves still swelled, restless and hungry, but the sky had begun to lighten, streaks of pale gray breaking through the chaos. Dorian stood by the mast, breath heavy, watching as the sea slowly settled. Around him, the crew moved with quiet efficiency, checking for damage, righting what had been thrown out of place. Elias emerged from the helm, his clothes still soaked, but his movement steady. He surveyed the deck, then looked at Dorian. "You stayed on your feet," he said. Dorian exhaled. His body ached, his hands were raw, but he only nodded. Elias smirked. Good. There was no lesson spoken, no grand acknowledgement of what had changed. But Dorian felt it. Something unspoken, something earned. He had weathered the storm. Not because of luck, not because someone else had saved him, because he had held on. The sea stretched endless before them, vast and unknown, and for the first time Dorian wasn't waiting to see where it would take him. He was ready to sail. The days after the storm were quieter, but the Isolde still moved steadily through the water, as though unbothered by the fury it had just faced. Dorian felt a strange calm settling over him. The chaos had passed, but the work remained. And there was something in that, a sense of continuity, a rhythm that kept moving even when the world seemed to stop. Elias gave him more responsibility now. He trusted Dorian with the finer details of the ship, the things that kept it afloat when the storm had passed and the seas were calm. Dorian tightened ropes, checked the sails, and sometimes found himself alone in the small hours of the morning, standing at the bow, watching the stars. The letter, his past, remained absent, forgotten in the depths of the sea. But still there were nights when the quiet seemed to press against him, and his thoughts wandered back to the man he had been before he stepped onto the ship. The man who had been lost in too many ways to count, the man who had run. Now he stood tall at the edge of the world, not fleeing from anything, not even from himself. One evening, As the ship slowed and the light of dusk spread across the water, Elias approached him at the helm. "You've learned a lot," Elias said, his tone light but not mocking. Dorian didn't answer right away. He knew what Elias meant. There was a difference between simply working and truly understanding. But the understanding was something that came with time, with effort. "I have," Dorian replied. Elias tilted his head, watching him for a long moment. "What do you think you're looking for?" Dorian hesitated. The question was not something he had expected. It wasn't about destinations anymore, not about fleeing or searching for a place to hide. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'll know it when I find it." Elias nodded slowly. "Good answer." And just like that, the moment passed. No judgment, no expectation. Just two men standing on the edge of the world, heading somewhere they could not yet see. But this time, Dorian didn't need to see it. He was already on his way. The days turned into weeks, then into months. The Isolde continued its steady path across the endless ocean, and Dorian found himself less aware of the passing time. There were mornings when he awoke to the sight of the sun rising over the water, a fiery streak of red and gold, and he would pause for a moment, wondering if he had been asleep for hours or days. It no longer mattered. The sea was a constant companion, its moods shifting like the weather. Some days it was calm and still, the surface smooth as glass, and other days it surged and roiled with such power that it felt as though the world itself might break apart. But through it all, Dorian stood at the helm, or climbed the rigging or tightened the sails, always moving, always learning. Elias had stopped giving him direct orders. There were no more lessons spoken aloud. Instead, the two men shared an understanding, an unspoken bond forged through shared work, the kind of connection that did not require words to be effective. One evening, Dorian stood at the bow, watching the horizon shift as the sky deepened into night. The stars were out, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer against the vast blackness above. Elias appeared beside him, his boots creaking softly on the deck. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice low. Dorian didn't turn to look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the stars. "I've been trying to." There was a pause. The sea surged beneath them, the sound of the waves constant and reassuring. "Not everyone can do what you've done," Elias said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "A lot of men would have quit long ago, or given up halfway. But you kept going." Dorian felt a quiet warmth spread through him. There was no pride in it, no boast. It was simply true. He had kept going. "I don't think I had a choice," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. Elias said nothing for a moment, just watching the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost contemplative. "You're right. Sometimes there is no choice, but that doesn't make it easy." Dorian nodded, understanding. The path hadn't been easy, but it had been his own, and that made all the difference. The two men stood in silence, the weight of the world spread out before them. The stars overhead, the endless sea below. And somewhere, in the distance, there was a land waiting, though neither of them knew what it would bring. But it didn't matter. Dorian knew now that it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey and the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what. And so they sailed on. The days began to blur, no longer measured by sunrise or sunset, but by the pulse of the ship itself. The slow rhythm of the waves, the creak of the wood, the steady sway of the sails. Dorian's body had become one with the ship, moving in time, with the motion of the ocean, his hands knowing the ropes before his mind could even process the need. He had found a new sense of peace here, on this ship that had once felt like a lifeline, and now felt like a part of him. Every knot, every pull of the rope, every shift of the wind was an echo of something deeper, something he could not yet name. There were moments when he stood at the edge of the deck, looking out over the endless water, and he would feel as though he were both infinitely small and infinitely large at once. The world stretched out before him, vast and uncharted. and yet he felt as though he belonged to it, as though the ocean had accepted him in a way nothing else had. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Elias handed him a map. Dorian took it, with raised brows. It wasn't that he didn't trust Elias, but maps weren't something they had needed. Elias smiled faintly. "It's time you learned the course." Dorian studied the map, the thin lines of land and water drawn in ink, the faint markings of distant shores that he'd never seen. "We've been sailing without a destination all this time." "A destination doesn't always mean a place," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to steer and when to let go." Dorian looked up at him, confused. Elias was staring out over the water, his expression distant, as though the sea was speaking to him in a language Dorian could not understand. Elias met his gaze, his eyes sharp and sure. "When you're out here long enough, you learn that it's not always about where you're going. Sometimes it's about trusting that you're going in the right direction." Dorian swallowed, feeling the weight of the words settle deep in his chest. It wasn't just about the ship or the sea or even the journey. It was about something deeper, something that had to come from within. He didn't know where they were going, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He trusted the course. He trusted the journey, and he trusted himself. As the seasons shifted, the rhythm of the ship continued, steady, unyielding. Dorian had learned to read the sky, to feel the shifts in the wind, to know the mood of the ocean, as if it were a companion. The work no longer felt like labor. It was a part of him, something he did without thinking, as natural as breathing. The crew had become more than just shipmates. They were brothers, bound not by blood, but by shared experience, by the quiet understanding that no one could survive on this endless sea without leaning on the others. In the early mornings, as the first light of dawn stretched across the water, Dorian would often find himself standing with Elias at the bow, side by side in silence. It was a kind of peace that could only be found out here, far from land, far from everything they had known. But as much as Dorian had come to accept this life, there were still moments when he felt a pull, a whisper from the past that tried to remind him of what he had left behind. It was never loud, never insistent, but it was there, lingering in the corners of his thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't quite fade. One evening, as they sailed beneath a sky full of stars, Dorian found himself on the deck alone, the quiet hum of the sea filling his ears. He leaned against the railing, staring into the blackness, watching the silver light of the moon stretch across the water. Elias approached, his footsteps steady and sure. "You've been quiet," he said. His voice gentle but knowing. Dorian didn't turn to him. "Just thinking." There was a long pause before Elias spoke again. "You know, you've come a long way since you first stepped aboard." Dorian didn't answer. He wasn't sure what there was to say. "I'm not going to ask you about the past," Elias continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "But I will tell you this. Whatever you were running from, it's not out here. This ship, this sea, it's not a way to escape. It's a way to find something you didn't know you had." Dorian looked over at him, meeting his gaze. There was no pity in Elias's eyes, no judgment, just understanding. It was as though he could see into Dorian's soul, knew the things he had never said aloud. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Dorian said, his voice low, almost uncertain. "But I think maybe I'm starting to understand why it doesn't matter." Elias gave him a small, approving nod. "That's the first step." The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that felt more like an answer than any words could provide. And as the ship sailed on into the endless night, Dorian felt something inside him shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, but a quiet realization, one that had been with him all along. The journey was never about escaping the past. It was about understanding the present and learning to trust that the path forward would reveal itself, step by step, and with that trust he was ready for whatever lay ahead. The winds had changed, and with them, The sea seemed to take on a new life. The Isolde sailed through it with a grace Dorian hadn't expected. It was as though the ship, too, had found its rhythm, moving effortlessly in sync with the ocean. It was no longer a struggle. It was a dance. Dorian stood at the helm one morning, his hands steady on the wheel, the horizon stretching before him. The ship was close to its destination now, wherever that might be. But that didn't matter. It wasn't about the place. It never had been. He glanced over his shoulder to see Elias watching him from the aft. Their eyes met, and there was a silent understanding between them, as if they had both arrived at the same conclusion without needing to speak it aloud. "We're almost there," Elias said, his voice calm. But there was something in his tone, something knowing. Dorian nodded, though he still didn't fully understand. "Almost where?" Elias chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Wherever it is you've been trying to go. I don't know what it is you're searching for, Dorian, but I do know this. Whatever it is, you're already on the way." The words hit Dorian in a way he hadn't expected. His gaze drifted over the sea, and for the first time it wasn't the unknown he saw. It wasn't the vast emptiness that had once unsettled him. It was home. Not because of the ship or the endless expanse of water, but because he had finally learned to be still. He had learned to trust the journey, to trust the path beneath his feet, even if it wasn't clear. He had stopped running, and for the first time in a long while, Dorian felt at peace with the man he had become. The ship continued its course, the waves rolling beneath them like an old, familiar song. The wind was gentle, the sky was clear, and Dorian felt the weight of his past lifting, not in some grand final release, but in the quiet realization that he was no longer bound by it. He wasn't where he had thought he would be. He wasn't even sure where he was going, but he knew one thing with certainty. He was going forward, and that was enough.